ages ago, sustainability in a company was really a ton about operations, operational efficiency, clean energy, scope 1, 2. To me, groups of companies coming together more often to create catalytic change is the next step change in the pace of climate action that we need to see. And so we need government to change. We need policy to change. We need markets to change. We need financial flows to change. And one of the best ways to do any of those things is to get leading companies to stand up and call for that change.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate tech. I'm your host, Samia, and today I'm speaking with Patrick Flynn. Patrick has spent nearly 2 decades working at the intersection of the environment, technology, and business. He spent 7 years as the head of global sustainability at Salesforce. And during that time, he helped Salesforce achieve net zero emissions and 100% renewable energy. He also helped build and bring to market the Net Zero Cloud product and many other things that we will discuss in this episode. Patrick is an advisor to Watershed Technology, Generation Investment Management, Topo Finance, and Humanitas.ai. He's also on the board of the Ocean Foundation. Patrick holds an MBA from MIT as well as a BS in engineering from Stanford University. In this episode, we talk about how corporates can use their influence to accelerate our path to net zero. We discuss at length Patrick's own experience of leading sustainability at Salesforce, as well as his current work at Topo Finance and the global impact of companies addressing their corporate cash emissions. And now onto the episode. You are one of the people that have been, there aren't that many of you, but you've been in energy, clean tech, climate tech your entire career. So for the past, call it almost 2 decades. The first thing I really wanted to ask you was, when you started doing this almost 20 years ago, how did you think things would look right now versus how they actually look?
When I started my career about 20 years ago, I was doing building engineering, high-rise HVAC engineering for buildings. And what captivated me was how broken the process was. Misaligned incentives, miscommunication. It just baffled me that such a big part of society, such a big part of the economy could do things irrationally or inefficiently, particularly with an environmental lens. I remember learning that a pump, buildings are full of pumps and fans. For a given pump or fan, 97% of the lifetime cost of that item is in the operational phase. And so if anybody was looking holistically at that economic situation, they would pay almost anything they could for the most efficient fan or pump up front in order to drive down the majority of the lifetime costs of the asset.
Right.
But the exact opposite was happening. Building developers were specifying the least efficient fan or pump they could just to meet code, because their incentive was to make a code compliant building as economically efficiently as possible,
right?
Not caring about lifetime costs. And with buildings, we're talking about designing something that's going to be around 50, 100 years, right? It makes sense for society to be thinking about it long term. And so that's what drew me in. How can this be so broken? Somebody in my position has the responsibility to see the big picture and design with the system in mind. So in a way, I ended up being the green building person in the company. In a way, the person in the company most focused on sustainability, but before that was a title or anything, just the green building projects that came to me. You asked about 20 years ago, what did I think 2024 would look like? I naively thought things could move faster than they do back then. It takes a long time to change people's behavior. I've learned that over the years. It takes a long time to change the inertia of the economy, building codes, incentive structures. I think back then I thought if I could just show how broken it was and fix it, then it would click into place and carry forward. So in some ways, improving the state of things has been slower and harder than I ever imagined. On the other hand, we've made it so incredibly far since then. And there's the saying that you overestimate the change that can happen in the short term and underestimate the change that can happen in the long term. I've definitely seen that play out. One example is clean energy, battery storage, smart buildings, assets interoperably working with the electricity grid. Even 20 years ago, people knew smart buildings, smart meters, interoperability, clean energy, that was going to be the future. It just took a long time to get there, but it's wonderful to see how pervasive that all is now.
Do you feel like now that there's much more of a time constraint and people are constantly kind of looking at the clock, do you think that that is going to expedite things?
20 years ago, it was rational to address the climate emergency by thinking that if we could get everybody involved and all companies, all people making incremental steps each year, that we could bring emissions down this very gentle glide path and be okay in the eyes of the climate emergency. Nowadays, that's no longer a rational strategy. We still need to wake as many companies up. We still need everyone to do every incremental thing they can. But to have any shot at a 1.5 degree future, a 2 degree future, we're talking about double-digit annual global emissions declines. And to do that, we need big catalytic change. And so I do think time is the most important variable here. Bill McKibben says with climate, winning slowly is the same as losing. And that's what really compels me in my work, the way I think about how I'm spending my own time. We need everyone in this focusing on those strategies that have a chance to get big enough, fast enough to matter. And yes, even the longest journey begins with the first step. So things start small, but the way to think about it in that analogy is we're not on a walking journey. Maybe take the first step, but take that step to a bike.
Yeah.
Take the bike and drive to a electric vehicle. Take the electric vehicle, drive on the highway. We need to kick off things that have exponential increases in their speed and scale.
So on that theme of time constraints, and sort of the systems level thinking that is required really to prioritize and deploy certain technologies over others, I would love to get into how you tackle the problem of, you were leading sustainability at Salesforce for 7 years, and it's a big job to take on. So while you were there for 7 years, you not only helped to define Salesforce's net zero strategy, but you actually set that strategy. You helped the company move to 100% renewable energy, and you helped add renewable energy to the grid, which is very significant. You built and brought to market Net Zero Cloud. You deployed a $1 billion sustainability bond. You invested into startups. You reduced this company's scope 3 emissions. You set an internal price for carbon. You did, I'm sure, many other things that I'm not going to list. But that's a lot of stuff. And you were dealing with a blank slate. So how did you think about that when you joined in terms of setting the strategy and what to prioritize?
Well, credit to those who were there before me. There was a sustainability program doing great things in buildings and data centers, and we already had some clean energy targets. So I was able to step into a situation already with forward momentum. But when you share the breadth of what we did, it brings to light the mindset that I brought to the job even from day one, which is I work for planet Earth and I'm employed by Salesforce. And my responsibility in this role is to pull on every lever for change that I can inside this amazing rocket ship of a company. And it is hard. Prioritization is very hard in that situation. And I always tried to make sure we were prioritizing the things that can get big enough, fast enough to matter, and those changes that either wouldn't happen or wouldn't happen fast enough unless Salesforce uniquely leaned into the situation. And net zero cloud is probably the best example of that. I didn't know it when I first stepped into the job, but even in the interview process, I was articulating that Salesforce needs to do Salesforce things for climate change. We need to figure out, how do we take the superpower of CRM, the superpower of having all of the world's most influential companies already on the platform. And the way that ended up manifesting was, we need to help all of Salesforce's customers on their own climate journey. We need to do best practice ourselves, but if we can enable all other companies out there on their own climate action journey, then we've really done something far bigger than even our own value chain.
So I had a great conversation that I just published with Nolan Lindquist, who works at the Center for Active Stewardship. And he looks at public companies, and he looks at their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and he focuses on that. And he said, for a lot of these companies, like on the Russell 1000 index, if your emissions isn't going up with sales, what you really should be looking at is the electricity mix of the company. And one of your targets was moving to 100% renewable energy. So where were they when you started? And was that something that you prioritized as well, and something that you identified immediately?
When I started, we had a 100% renewable energy goal for all of scope 1 and 2. And within that, and at that time, there was a high degree of variability in the quality of a company's renewable energy strategy. And we prioritized bringing new renewable energy onto the grid. So high additionality of our actions. And that went even further over the years in terms of bringing new renewable energy to the parts of the country, the parts of the world that need it most. So seeking out some of the dirtiest grids, or some renewable energy deployments that not only change the cleanliness of the grid, but also delivered co-benefits, like putting renewable energy on hospital roofs in Ghana, not just to clean up the grid, but to also provide more reliable electricity to those critical services.
So there's a number of different things that you focused on. A lot of that is related to scope 1 and 2. You also reduced the company's scope 3 emissions. You invested in startups, which is a totally different strategy. And then you created a new product. How did you think about that when you started in terms of prioritizing things? Did you decide to sort of tackle it all at once? Did you have a team? If you were to, I guess where I'm getting at is, if you were to start at another company now, maybe not the size of Salesforce, not every company has a 200 billion market cap, but let's just say you were starting to lead the sustainability efforts at another corporate, what would you try to tackle first? And how would you do things differently?
The first place to start would be to develop an understanding of the company's scope 1, 2, 3 footprint. There are plenty of great tools out there that can do that. I've been really impressed with what's happening at Watershed and their ability to decompose deep scope 3 emissions.
You're an advisor for Watershed, right?
Yeah, that's right. I love their team. I love their technology. The mission is aligned with my own. So part of the puzzle, if you're stepping into a new role leading sustainability at a company, or leading climate, let's just stick with climate.
Yeah.
Understand the material sources of emissions behind what it is that you do. For most companies, most emissions are in scope 3. Most often, most of those scope 3 emissions are not even in the direct tier 1 supplier, but deeper upstream. And if you look at that, you might find hotspots or material areas where your company can uniquely shift things for the better. So that would be one, just prioritizing in terms of emissions magnitude, the types of strategies that might be deployed. Maybe it's clean energy, maybe it's transportation, land use, forestry, depends on the nature of the business a little bit. But I'd encourage leaders not to get way too detailed into the math, chasing the final decimal place, but just get a sense of what the big things that need to change that'll deliver emissions benefit to your value chain. That's sort of one ingredient to developing the strategy. Another is understanding what motivates the business. How has the company made big decisions in the past? Is it a company that analyzes things financially with incredible rigor and where everything really needs to be clearly in the money, financially logical, and start building business cases for the strategy? Or is it the type of company where doing the right thing or supporting supply chain or reaching customers with a new, more sustainable product is compelling? And maybe that shapes the strategy a little bit as well. But that maybe starts to help define looking at where one ought to focus from the math and how a company thinks about creating big change. Those two things combined can generate a pretty good prioritized list of what to go for. The other ingredient is who the people are inside the company making those decisions. So with the one thing they say about leading sustainability in companies is your job is to put yourself out of a job, which is to say embed sustainability practices deeply into the organization, so much so that it's common practice, that it's just what you do. And who the people are, what motivates them in different parts of the organization, that really matters. If you hit it off with somebody who's in the data center procurement team and who's really passionate about climate, meet them where they are and equip them. And maybe that becomes a big part of the strategy because it's a fast acting path through the people who are motivated. So the people matter quite a bit as well. The other thing I would do is think about superpowers. If you dropped me into a company that had a huge amount of operations in Indiana, an Indiana focused strategy from that company makes a ton of sense. What other change maker might be able to influence policy or utilities in Indiana, just as a throwaway example? So superpowers can be technological. They can be about geography. They can be about the customer. It could be about the supply chain. But what needs to happen that won't happen unless this company steps in and really starts to make it happen?
I'm going to get back to that topic of superpowers because I think it's really interesting and something that everyone needs to think about. But something that you said brought up a question in my mind, which is that one of the problems that we're seeing across the board for early stage climate tech startups is that when selling to corporates, there's a disconnect between the chief sustainability officer and the CFO. And we have a lot of these startups sort of pitching to the CSO, and the CSO is really interested because the product is really useful, and they sign up for a pilot. And then once that pilot's over, then the startup has to go and sell to the CFO. And then you have to show a cost benefit to the company. And we're seeing that a lot in this particular economic environment where, if there is some sort of regulation coming on immediately and a corporate doesn't have to do something, then all they care about is cost. And so do you have any advice for startups on how to get around this or navigate this problem?
Yeah. I first saw this challenge from the opposite perspective when I was doing clean tech venture capital back in the clean tech 1.0, the aughts. It's often referred to as the valley of death. A startup company might have a better product, but there's a chasm. And part of the way to build a bridge across that chasm is to have a few big first customers who validate the real world deployment of the solution and endorse it, and then can get others to feel comfortable adopting the technology, to give financiers the comfort to put more capital into the business to scale up to meet that coming demand. There's a chicken and egg there with early customer adoption. And for what it's worth, having recognized that from the venture side of things early in my career, I felt a big responsibility within Salesforce to use our platform as a way to help fantastic technologies build a bridge across that valley of death. One example is the Blackwater system that we ended up deploying in Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. Water recycling needs to become more prevalent. And Australian group called Aquacell had a great technology to do it. They had deployed it in a couple of big buildings in Australia. But not only did we want to execute a great water strategy at Salesforce, it also felt like we really need to do this because we can help that company with yet another landmark marquee customer and help them land even their next one after us. So whether it was the real estate platform or data centers, as a willing pilot customer of new technologies and new approaches, we could help build bridges across the valley of death for startups.
I've struggled with this where I've helped some of our investment or portfolio companies and I've talked to corporates and they love the startup and they're kind of like, well, here's the thing. We need to get buy-in from our executive management in order to have any sort of agreement with this startup. I'm like, that's a Series B company, right? That's not a pre-seed company.
Yeah.
And they love the technology. They love everything about it, but they need it to be later stage and they don't want to be the first customer. So how do you start getting more buy-in from other corporates if they don't have someone like you that comes from a venture background and understands the valley of death?
Well, first on the disconnect between the CSO and the CFO. One nice thing that's happening is that the world of the chief sustainability officer and the chief financial officer are coming closer and closer together very rapidly, particularly as we get to a place where we need mandatory disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. Financial reporting starts to need to include very high quality emissions data in it. And so those teams are coming together to do that exercise across countless companies everywhere in the world. One drawback is that then takes a ton of the focus of both of those teams at the intersection of finance and sustainability and orients it towards measuring what has happened in the past with incredible rigor instead of together looking towards the future and figuring out what to do together to change the numbers next year and the year after that. So we need sustainability leaders out there to take this newfound trusted relationship with the finance organization and not stop at what needs to be done right in front of them today, which is that their greenhouse gas emissions data reaches the quality of their financial data, but leverage those teams and the buy-in to also start thinking about changing the future for the better. Making the business case is a big part of that. And it would take shape differently in different companies. One that is very low margin, stable. The best business cases are going to be about streamlining operations, efficiency, reducing turnover, and boosting the bottom line.
Yeah.
For a high growth company, the most attractive thing might be attracting and retaining new amazing customers because you are out competing your peers on a sustainability basis and growing faster. One of the latent and hidden sources of value often has to do with employees. Employees are one of the biggest costs of almost any company. And if you can attract top talent, retain top talent because of your commitment to your values, you can really strengthen the company. And it's not too difficult to put some rough math around reduced employee turnover and see how effective that is to making the business, augmenting the business case for sustainability leadership.
What about, we're seeing this a lot in the built environment. So technologies that are incredibly useful for architects or engineers, but because the regulation hasn't come online yet and they're really thinking about costs and their margins are thin, they don't want to do it right now. And it's one of those industries, like you said, with the HVAC systems or like with heat pumps, where once you've made that initial investment, like that's it. It's built into the infrastructure of the building. So do you have any thoughts on how to maybe try to break into corporates in those types of industries where the margins are thin, but they really need to be thinking ahead, 10, 20 years before a building is actually built and constructed.
Yeah, it brings to light a emerging strategy that I'm very passionate about. Systemic interventions for climate action. Let me describe it this way. Ages ago, sustainability in a company was really a ton about operations, operational efficiency, clean energy, scope 1, 2. Not too long ago, we started looking at scope 3, indirect emissions, value chain emissions. And the strategy within that was push my direct suppliers. So not only do I have climate goals, but I have influence and I know a person at this supplier. I'm going to get that team to get that company to set their own climate goals. I think the next step along this journey from operational focus to value chain focus now is about zooming out from your particular company and the relationships you have directly, and instead thinking about the systems in which your extended value chain operates. In this example about the struggle for a better building technology to get adopted, my brain first goes to changing building codes. And if we're going to try to get building codes to be better, there's no greater force for that than a bunch of leading companies calling for that change. Groups of companies have this superpower capability to tip the balance in big moments, policy or market signaling. And even if it's not going to directly, immediately change my emissions, if I can get building codes to become better, then there's a huge change in future emissions broadly that creates a trickle-down emissions benefit through my value chain and to me. So if I were a startup with a better building technology, struggling to have it adopted, in addition to going directly to the customers, I might think about who their customer is, and do any of those have sway over the building codes or the insurance policies or anything that I need to change? And can I leapfrog maybe my direct customer and find a way to rally change that will benefit me?
That's an excellent piece of advice. On that, when you were talking about that example, I was thinking when you're talking about building codes, the immediate thought I had was policy. And also like this perception that policy sort of needs to lead the way. But you've said before that policy and regulation are important, but they move slowly, which we all know. Do you think that the energy transition and our path to net zero can mostly be steered by corporates and private capital?
The short answer is yes. Mm-hmm. The slightly longer answer is companies can change policy. To me, groups of companies coming together more often to create catalytic change is the next step change in the pace of climate action that we need to see. And so we need government to change. We need policy to change. We need markets to change. We need financial flows to change. And one of the best ways to do any of those things is to get leading companies to stand up and call for that change.
That perfectly transitions us into your next role at Topo Finance. So can you tell me a little bit about your work as the Director of Corporate Climate Action at Topo Finance?
This is a big one. This is an exciting one. It falls squarely into the category of something that can get big enough, fast enough to really matter. The emissions associated with cash in the hands of a bank who doesn't just keep it in a vault. They redeploy it into the real economy, including into fossil fuel projects. When you do the math on $1 million of cash unfettered in the hands of a typical US bank, it's 300 tons of emissions per year. So $1 billion is 300,000 tons of emissions per year. And for me, it was a blind spot. I didn't realize it, partly because the transparency from the banks is only now just coming, partially because cash-related emissions are not required to be disclosed in the greenhouse gas protocol if you're not a financial institution. But whether or not the greenhouse gas protocol begins to include it, this is still a huge lever for change that any company can have agency over. And when you do the math for a company that's got a lot of cash and a carbon light business model, the emissions associated with the cash in the hands of their banks is often bigger than their scope 1, 2, 3 combined. And so what I'm doing for Topo is trying to make sure everyone out there who's in a position of influence on climate in companies sees this lever and recognizes it as an important tool for change. One of the nice things is, even though it may be a shock, it may be a new strategy, it's not foreign. We know how to work with this phenomenon. It reminds me a lot of the state of renewable energy, clean energy a decade or more ago, because you had leading companies, tech companies, who were focused on scope 2 emissions at the time and wanted utilities to change and had a lot of electricity consumption that they could bring to that conversation. We want you to do better. And as that started to take form, the utilities were often monopolies in the regions where companies were operating, incredibly hard to change. How might we ever exert enough influence to change the utility? In some ways, I think that's similar to where we are now with trying to change banks' behavior. These are huge, some of the biggest organizations in the world, the most capital in the world. How might my company ever create change there? Well, it starts with just having a conversation. Have you talked to your bank about how you have net zero goals and they have net zero goals, and you would like the products and services they're delivering to your company to have a sustainability lens added to them? And that, to me, is what's exciting about the work with Topo. We are early. There's far more awareness than there was even a year or two ago. Leading companies are engaging with their banks and calling for change. And I've seen this play out in the energy sector before, where once a few banks change, offer leading products, companies start to talk about it and be proud of the change and that they've been able to create, it really will take off. I think it's inevitable, absolutely inevitable, that leading companies think of their cash as an important lever for climate action. And the work of Topo, in my mind, is to make sure that inevitability happens in the next few quarters instead of the next few years, because again, time is the biggest challenge here. So getting companies aware, giving them the tools they need to have an intelligent conversation with their treasury first. Sustainability and treasury teams need to align. And then together, sustainability and treasury need to open up a dialogue with their banks to ask for them to do more good and do less harm with the cash that they've got.
Is it likely that someone else will step in to fill this gap? I had this conversation with James, but I actually didn't ask him this question. And I pulled some stats on this. So last year, commercial banks lent $632 billion to fossil fuel companies, down from $802 billion the previous year, which is great. But we're seeing PE firms and insurance companies step in to fill that gap. Last year, PE firms lent the industry $9 billion, up from only $450 million in the preceding 2 years. There are also other forms of finance popping up, like transition credits that, for example, allow owners of coal plants to raise funds to shut down operations issued by banks like HSBC. So if you have corporates taking action, telling JP Morgan and Barclays, like, you can't use our cash to fund fossil fuel companies, are the PE guys just going to step in and take the lead and fill that gap?
I see what you're pointing out, and there is some logic to that. And the way that looks is, sure, the big name brand bank may not be making these investments, but what we are going to have is even lesser known, even less accountable actors making the same investments if we get the banks to stop doing it. And there is definitely a logic to that. But I think it's a necessary step in our forward progress, because if we remain in a state where nobody's really doing all that well and it's not that transparent, then we could just stay in this mode of finger pointing and there's no real clear banking leader. So we need to break out of this stable moment, the moment where there's sort of safety in inaction among the banks. Get one to break forward.
Yeah. We also need more accountability from these private companies as well. They have investors too. Their LPs are big asset managers, and they're the ones that need to come and say effectively the same thing the PE funds that we're saying to banks.
That's right. I was going to get to that same point, which is right now you've got private equity firms, banks, all still funding fossil fuels more than we need. If we can get pressure from companies to move banks to do better, then even if the same investments start to be executed by smaller entities, private equity firms, we then have a concentration of the next place to focus, right? Almost think about trying to, what you say about private equity firms have stakeholders who can influence them to do better is exactly right. The game moves on to then making those institutions more accountable, more transparent. Each step is a step of forward progress. So I think in so many things, we need to take the next right step forward, even if there are some drawbacks to doing it. Let's take the step and then reassess and figure out what the new pressure needs to be.
Right. So basically work our way through the value chain effectively.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there is no greater force than customer demand. I saw this in my role leading sustainability for a data center company. We wanted very badly to have tech companies adopt our more sustainable services. And if they said, you need to adopt this technology for us to be more likely to go with you, we would have done it, right? And so what we're lacking here is a bunch of companies articulating that demand signal to banks. Mm-hmm. I think about back in February, Bank of America, there was a New York Times article by Hiroko Tabuchi articulating that Bank of America had walked back some of its commitments to no longer invest in coal. And my hunch is that they didn't get a whole bunch of customer calls when that happened. But imagine if Amazon walked back its climate commitments. I am sure that a bunch of companies who know Amazon is in their supply chain would call. This is where banks and the utility clean energy story overlaps again for me. A decade ago, if a utility walked back a clean energy goal, I think there would have been pressure, but not necessarily customer pressure, because we thought of them as these monopolies that are so tough to change. In a way, banks are that way for us right now. Customers with large cash positions have untapped influence, latent change-making potential that we are just not using, even in the slightest. And that's what we're doing with Topo, try to articulate a demand signal, especially from those companies that have big amounts of cash in the hands of the banks.
How are you seeing the response from corporates in your work there?
It's fantastic. We're starting from a very early stage. The step one is just recognizing that this is a real lever for change, going from unaware to aware. And that's been going very well. Often in the conversations we are having, the sustainability leader then says, I get it. I've got a lot on my plate, but if you can tell me what to do, point me in the right direction, count me in. And so now we need to have the advanced team, the Patagonias, the Atlassians, who are having these conversations and creating forward progress with the banks. There are a whole bunch of B Corp companies, countless, who are engaging in this conversation with their banks. Those trailblazers are going to catalyze the creation of new products, new metrics, and they will feed back to the many, many companies who are ready to be fast followers, the playbook, the path. And so we are right on the brink of this rapid acceleration of changing banks through their biggest customers.
It's really exciting work. I can't wait to see. I mean, already just the knowledge of financed emissions, I'm seeing it everywhere now. And it's something that I was completely unaware of. I've spent half my career working at banks, so I had absolutely no idea. So I can't wait to see what the team at Topo Finance does with this.
Many leading companies are looking at the challenge of addressing Scope 3 emissions, especially because even if you could execute all of the customer pressure on your direct suppliers, change your operations, there are still deep extended emissions far up the value chain that are holding companies back from meeting their near-term climate targets, which are coming due very soon.
Mm-hmm.
And turns out the best way to address those deep emissions in the supply chain is to change financial flows. And so talking to the banks to try to get them to invest in more sustainable solutions, clean energy, to take investments away from dirty energy. That is one of the clearest, albeit indirect, clearest pathways to get background decarbonization to come through all of one's supply chain indirectly. And it's yet another force that is motivating companies to see the exciting reality of addressing financed emissions.
It's also an opportunity for any of the founders listening for startups to step in and create other opportunities or tools or products to invest in as an alternative.
That's absolutely true. We need more financial products that do good and less harm. And even a small company can talk to its bank about better products that it needs and show the solutions that that collaborative bank comes forward with. Again, we're at this moment where showing the way forward, even from a company that may not be the biggest in the world, does a tremendous amount of value to bringing the big, fast followers forward on their journey.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to ask you one final question because I know that you like to talk about superpowers. You referenced it earlier on in this conversation. I'm told that you like to ask people specifically about their sustainability superpower. So first, what does that mean to you? And second, what is yours? And what are some of the answers that you have received from people in your organization that helped you as a manager align their work with their superpower?
To me, using one's superpower has to do with recognizing what it is you do best and doing that for climate action. And it's true at the individual level. Artists need to make art for climate change, musicians, lawyers, accountants, because with climate, everything must change. There is a job for you that meets your unique skill set. Same for companies. If you're in automotive or airlines or insurance, do that for climate. Become a climate leader with what you do best. Could be about changing your supply chain, could be about demonstrating new customer demand for better products and services, could be about influencing your local government. But take your unique capability to create change and do it for climate. I am very quick to be able to name other people's superpowers. I'm terrible at putting words to my own.
I think that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. If I had to answer, I think let's not call them superpowers. Let's call them strengths. That makes me feel a little more comfortable. One is never settling. I'm always looking at the incredible pace of change that we need to meet the climate emergency and trying to catalyze big change that can be relevant in the face of the crisis. Another for me, I think, and I hear this from many other sustainability leaders, is the ability to translate from the language used within different parts of their business. You talk to the finance team about making the business case way differently than you talk to the procurement team about how to engage suppliers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's really important for getting buy-in.
Yes. If you're going to create change, you need to change people. If you are going to change a person, you need to understand them, what keeps them up at night, what gets them out of bed in the morning in your organization. Work with those ingredients, but also approach them with the language and the business empathy needed for them to see you as a guide, not just somebody shouting or pounding the fist. You need to meet them where they are. And that has a lot to do with translating, not just in the words, but also the constraints, the goals, and understanding of what they're going through.
Somebody told me this once, and I think it's so true. The easiest way to get somebody to be angry with you is to take the moral high ground. So to treat somebody else like they're lower than you from a moral perspective immediately turns them off. And so I think that's something that we should constantly always be wary of when we're talking to people who we're trying to get buy-in from.
That's absolutely true. Conversely, the best way to create change is to paint a picture of the future that's better than what that person was previously headed towards. And better can be about less risk. It can be about more leadership, but meeting them where they are and sharing how exciting going on a journey with you can be is the best way to bring somebody with you. Companies have an awe-inspiring capacity to create positive change. And if you're going to change a company on climate, you need to often work through the head of climate in that company, often called the chief sustainability officer. And the reality is that person is juggling so much. It's a decathlon of events, from reporting to renewable energy to buildings to supply chain, and you need to finish each event. So they are completely focused on this incredible breadth of program execution that it takes to have a credible brand. And what we need is for those individuals to become superhuman in their capacity to create big change. And that's currently exactly what I'm focused on. Try to help the business world's most influential climate leaders become superhuman in their impact by moving them more quickly through what they already have on their plate. If I can give advice or connect them to a startup or to a peer who's already done it. And on top of that, I aim to deliver a little bit more to their plate every now and then. But the good news is it's the good stuff. It's the dessert, the big catalytic changes that only their company coming together with others can kick off, which will have big impact for society and for their value chain a little bit indirectly. But changing policy, sending demand signals, rallying behind a new technology, getting a building code to change, that's the exciting stuff to a head of sustainability in a company, because it can create big, fast change. And yet it's hard to scan the universe for all of those moments. But with my newfound free time, not having to conduct the decathlon of events inside a company anymore, I can curate, matchmake, and bring these moments forward as much on a silver platter as I possibly can to the business world's most influential climate leaders.
And that is it for today's episode of Climate Tech 360. If you found this episode useful, then please subscribe and leave a positive review, as it makes it easier for people to find the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you at the next one. Bye, everyone.